welcome to you all to this joint symposium of the Australian Academy of Science and the Australian. On behalf of both academies, I acknowledge and pay, in particular, I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I speak. This is the fourth joint symposium of the two academies, now held annually. The series was inaugurated in 2018 in the long distant times when we could iconic Shine Dome in Canberra, but hopefully next year's symposium can be delivered wherever you are in Australia or indeed around the world. It's also my see a fellow of both academies, the Academy of Science and the Academy of Law. Annabelle Bennett's current positions I can't do justice to. They cover a page. They include being Chancellor of Bond University, the Chair of the ANSTO Board, an Arbitrator of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, a Director of the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, and the Chair of the World Intellectual Property Organisation Advisory Group of Judges. She also practices as a barrister in an advisory role and as a mediator and arbitrator. Her former positions, leaving aside her current positions, cover 2 pages. She demonstrates how inappropriate it is to refer to Annabelle Bennett as a retired judge of the Federal Court, or indeed retired from anything. Please welcome Dr. Annabelle Bennett. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. That's unbelievably kind and generous, and welcome to everybody. The academies were aiming to explore the topic of the uses and misuses of artificial intelligence in science and the law. So I guess my first reaction when the topic came up to me was, is this all of a sudden, or has it crept upon us? Now, I'm a science fiction aficionado, and I can say that when I was watching Star Trek, obviously as a tiny child, which was the original Star Trek, the idea that you could walk up to a door and it opened was science fiction. Now we know that that wonderful William Shatner, who played Captain James T. Kirk, is about to go into space, which is an interesting change to science fiction turning into reality. And in Brave New World Revisited, Aldous Huxley revealed how much of his original book had actually come to pass, almost unnoticed. So now we have questions being answered differently all over the world of whether a machine can be an inventor for the purposes of the Patents Act. So for me, when this topic came up, I had to realise that for myself, maybe because I'm a certain age, I thought to myself, well, actually, what is machine learning? What is artificial intelligence? We use the words, but do we actually understand how it works? Is it a wonderful objective purveyor of data and evidence devoid of human error? Or is it a tool that can be manipulated willingly or unwillingly? Is it a tool that can or should replace human decision-making with all of the latter's advantages and disadvantages? Now, we have speakers today from science and the law who have expertise in considering these issues and others as they stand now and as they'll apply in the future. That is, the future directions that this area can explore. Now, before we go in, I should say that in the interest of full disclosure, the 2 law speakers are known to me. Lyria Bennett Moses is my daughter, and obviously the daughter of myself and my husband, David. And David is relevant in another way because he actually introduced Ed Santo's parents to each other. So that means that we are responsible for both of them being here to talk to you today. In any event, this is truly an area where science and the law can and should work together. It's also going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel. And believe me, I'm the first one to say there are no stupid questions in this developing area. So throughout the event, if you have any questions for the panel or a specific speaker, please enter them via the website or QR code on your screen. Now, as always is the case in this wonderful world of technology, we've had some technical difficulties, and we are going to reorder the speakers. And it may well be that our first speaker, who we were hoping to have, Professor Svetha Venkatesh, may not be able to join us because of the technical difficulties in joining. So I'm going to move straight to our first speaker now, who was always going to be a speaker, of course, is Professor Toby Walsh. Toby is the Scientia Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of New South Wales. He's a leading researcher in AI and leader of the Algorithmic Decision Theory Group at CSIRO Data 6.
Saying, I'm an AI researcher. I spent my whole professional life trying to work on building smarter and more intelligent machines. And this is by far the most exciting time. So I have an interesting story about opening doors automatically. Those of you who noticed that Facebook was down a couple of days ago, it comes down, the system administrators couldn't get into the server rooms because where they actually cut the door open. But we are making real progress. As an example, I mentioned something that blew my mind away when I was reading the scientific paper just quite recently, which is that some AI researchers in the UK took the UK gene bank. There's a database of 500,000 genotypes. They've sequenced 500,000 genotypes of people in the UK. They've got all their phenotypical, all their physical characteristics, their medical records to go alongside that. And using some relatively simple machine learning techniques, they're able now to predict how tall you're going to be to within an inch. So at birth, they can tell you how tall you're going to be, but they can tell you actually more fundamentally interesting things. For example, they can tell you whether you're going to be susceptible to bowel cancer. That is the third most common form of cancer, second deadliest form of cancer. And now we can tell you at birth whether, of course, there are environmental factors that need to still trigger it, but now we can actually prevent you from falling prey to bowel cancer by ensuring that you get tested from an early age if you are unlucky enough to have the genotype that makes you susceptible to that. But despite all that wonderful progress, it's not magic. This is, if you believed everything you read in the newspapers and added it all together, you might think that we are about to build machines that are as smart, if not way smarter than us. We've still got a long distance to go, but we can do very useful things, like you say. And it's a dual-use technology. There's immense good that you can do with it, but also there's significant harms. And so actually I spend a lot of time discussing with the media and elsewhere about the ethical challenges that the technology is starting to throw up as it leaves the laboratory and starts becoming an everyday part of our lives. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is not the first technology to touch human lives. We've invented lots of other technologies in the past that have had significant consequences. And so we don't need too much in the way of new ethics, at least. We'll come to law in a second, but at least in terms of new ethics, to understand some of the challenges that this technology is throwing up. And indeed, perhaps the best place to look is to look to medicine. Medicine is by its very nature a technology that literally touches people's human lives. And it is a good starting point and even, might I say, almost an ending point in the discussions as to what are the ethical principles that should be guiding the safe deployment of this technology within our lives. There is one exception, one new thing that AI brings that previous technologies, medical technologies or other sorts of technologies never brought, and I'll come to that in a second. But if we look at medical ethics, there are 4 cornerstones for medical ethics, and they provide, actually, I believe, excellent cornerstones for understanding the sorts of ethical challenges that artificial intelligence throws up. So what are those 4 cornerstones? Beneficence, do net good. Non-maleficence, closely related but significantly different, do no harm, worrying about the harms to the individual. Autonomy, respecting the autonomy of individuals. In medical ethics, as same in deployment of AI, we have to worry about respecting human autonomy, about not engaging in deceptive and other practices. And then the final cornerstone, a rather encompassing cornerstone of justice, which brings in issues of fairness and equitability and issues like this. So you might notice that there was one principle that I didn't mention that frequently gets mentioned in these conversations. One that, for example, is at the cornerstone at IBM's ethical guidelines for how they're going to deploy AI, and that's transparency. I believe actually transparency is the most overrated ethical principle. It is a means to an end and is not an end in itself. There are many settings where it may not be possible. AI algorithms, at least certainly today, are very much black boxes. And it's not clear to me that we would necessarily be able to open them out. We can build wonderful computer vision systems that can see the road and drive your autonomous car. But just like human vision is not something that we can explain, I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to explain computer vision systems. And indeed, there are a number of settings where it's not desirable for us to explain how the systems work. It is a good thing, for example, that Google does not explain how its machine learning AI is used to serve up search results for you, because that would open it to being manipulated even more than it is today. A final observation is that humans are not transparent. Human decision-making is not transparent. I go to my doctor and I put my life in her hands. And I can do that with a lot of trust. Not because she's transparent, but because I know that we have built institutions in which I don't have to be an expert on medicine. I don't have to ask her always for why she is prescribing a particular medicine, but that I know that if she kills too many of her patients or she prescribes medicines that are dangerous, that she will be struck off the register and lives will be saved. So transparency, I believe, is somewhat, where it's possible and where it doesn't introduce problems like hackers, then it may be a useful means to an end, the end being some greater ethical principle like fairness, but it's not an end in itself. So I mentioned there was one exception, one new thing that AI brings as a technology, and that's something that we've never seen with any other technology, and that brings us back to autonomy. I was talking previously about the autonomy of humans, that we have to respect people's human autonomy. That's a fundamental human right. But we also have to now worry about the autonomy of machines, that we are now building machines with capabilities that allow them, largely independently of us, to make decisions on their own. When you sit in your autonomous car, you say, "Take me home," and it makes many decisions. So, not surprisingly, we've seen some of the most interesting, some of the most novel ethical debates around these issues of the autonomy of machines. We see this in autonomous cars, the famous trolley problem that you may have heard of, where a machine may have to make a split-second life or death decision as to an accident's about to happen and who might of machines in the battlefield. Very challenging ethical, legal machines to make independent creations of themselves, and how we're going to have to adjust our laws and ideas about intellectual property. If it is the machines are autonomously of us, novel parts of the ethical debate that we are now seeing is that various red lines are starting to be drawn in the sand, that there are some uses of these technologies that are going to be very disruptive. And so we've seen very recently a vote was made just yesterday or the day before, the European Parliament, calling for a ban on public use of facial recognition, access to people with disability and the like. But now I actually think it's such a destructive, such a potentially dangerous technology that probably we shouldn't be working on it at all. But other examples of red lines in terms of social credit scoring and subliminal manipulation and micro-targeting of political adverts, where we might decide that the downsides of the technology are so great that we perhaps should not work on them at all. So I'll end there and look forward to the other speakers.
Well, I must say you have absolutely opened up a lot of areas there. I mean, you've introduced, I think, a number of issues. It reminds me of the fact that I was once at a talk where they used the examples of what is life, and using the characteristics of what constitutes life. One of machines, by means of machine learning, or an artificial intelligence, could be called a new life form. And that brings all my sci-fi experience. I'm going to give rise to the discussion. Some of the issues is old, but of course it's also the touchscreen smartphone was such a new thing. And by the time the case, I think, as we go. But of course, even the sharing of who's wearing what car to transmit that information to the following car. Anyway, I'm not going to go into this anymore myself, because I'm going to urge people to ask those questions, to formulate them and ask them. And now I'm going to turn to Ed Santo. Ed served as Australia at UTS. He leads a major UTS initiative, responsible innovation, by developing a bit of an understanding too about what AI and machine.
From Warimba land in Gadigal country, and I pay tribute to the elders past, present and emerging of this land. Some of that hype is completely unjustified, but I'm at risk of engaging in some of that hype myself, because the thesis I'm going to try and advance over the next, how we reason and how we search for truth. And that search for truth is very important, because one thing that scientists and lawyers about the world around us, and that may be in different contexts and different areas, but that fundamental belief in the importance of truth is something we share. It's true that I'm going to start with a bit of having a lawyer try and talk to you about science is a bit like having an English person trying to teach you French. Fortunately, Toby is in the position of being able to provide a rebuttal or a clarification. It's this, because at the heart of AI, and really it brings together a cluster of technologies and techniques, but one of them is machine learning. And machine learning is very important because it's, so I'm just going to quickly walk. The idea is you want your computer, your machine. So for example, each of what's known as training data, you'll have in retrospect determined were good to turn out to have been not so good customers. So you'll label them according for patterns. So what are the sorts of features that will be common among your prospective customer? And is this person likely to be a good customer or a bad customer? Now, I've chosen to start with an example which many of us may experience once or twice in our lives, not very commonly, but this sort of technique is happening all the time. I suspect today everyone listening in will have experienced this in many ways, even if you haven't noticed it. So the example I'll just quickly give is email, right? So if you're using one of the kind of leading email platforms, it will have done much the same thing as I've just described. So it will trawl through millions, perhaps even billions of emails, and through a labeling process, it will have been able to understand, or sorry, not understand, but perceive or identify the sorts of features that are associated with genuine emails. By genuine email, I don't necessarily mean an email that you want to receive, but an email that you should receive, as distinct from emails that are spam, that are there to kind of scam you out of your money, not genuine in any way, shape or form. And so what happens, of course, is that there's a filter system, and most of the emails that turn out to be spam end up in your spam folder. Occasionally, and this actually happened to me today in a very kind of upsetting way, really, an email that I sent to someone ended up in their spam folder. So occasionally there will be mistakes, and that's the nature of correlation. It won't be a kind of an analysis, a deductive analysis like is prized most highly, especially in the legal system. It'll be based on correlations, and so some of those correlations will be meaningful, some of them won't. So what I'm trying to say to you is at the heart of machine learning is a focus on correlation. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's always been at the heart of inductive reasoning. But we're relying more on correlation than we ever have in human history because of this rise in the use of machine learning. And the difficulty is, as I kind of intimated before, not all correlations are meaningful. There are lots of examples. The example I've just put on the screen now comes from a website of an academic who loves to show this point, which is that not all correlations are meaningful. So the one I'm showing here is the correlation between the rise in cheese consumption in the United States and the rise in the number of people who pretty sadly die by getting tangled in their bed sheets. Now, I'm very confident that that is a meaningless correlation. They do correlate reasonably closely, but it's meaningless, right? Like it is just pure coincidence. It's white noise. But nevertheless, there may appear to be a correlation between those two unconnected things. And so the point is, we need to work very hard to sift out what are the meaningful correlations and what are the meaningless correlations, that they're kind of red herrings. And that's very important, because the promise of being able to use machine learning through big data and so on is that we get to insights. And sometimes we do. I quite like this cartoon, which is the last slide I'm going to share, because it shows how this can go really, really well. You start with data points, you get information, the knowledge. Suddenly you're able to see, oh, there seems to be this connection between this one thing, maybe people who are more likely to return to my home loan example, people who from a particular postcode seem to be more likely to pay back their home loans on time. That's a really interesting thing. Sometimes you get wisdom from that, because you say, well, we think therefore that it must be because of this is the connection to their postcode. And sometimes that just goes terribly, terribly awry. And that's how you end up with the bottom right-hand corner, the conspiracy theory. You join the dots together in a way that doesn't give you insight at all. It just gives you a completely false picture of the world. And so I guess just to round off what I'm trying to say, the more we use machine learning techniques in big decisions, really momentous decisions that affect people in profound ways, the more we have the capacity to see insights that would otherwise be hidden from us. And I say that because what I guess modern AI is able to do is, through this pattern recognition, if you couple that with a massive increase in computing power, it's able to kind of look for, to use an anthropomorphic term, patterns or correlations that we just simply wouldn't have time to do if it was just humans kind of performing that task. And so the exciting thing is that there are ways of automating or ideally semi-automating that process that allows us to get genuine insights. But the more we kind of cede control over to the machine without effective oversight and quality measures put in place to make sure that we're able to sift between correlations that are meaningful and correlations that aren't, the more likely we are that we're also going to not just have insights, but also be led down incorrect paths that will take us away from the truth. And those, the difficulty is those two things are happening simultaneously. There is both good and bad happening. So I might leave off there and hand back to Annabelle as our chair, and look forward to participating in the Q&A later on.
Simplifying the issues, I want to thank you for making it clear that it's very straightforward, that there's no complexity in this, that it was easy as pie to deal with. I think that's terrific. The answer is no, you didn't. No. What you've done beautifully for us, I think, is to raise the good news, bad news story. And I mean, it's very hard. It's hard for the scientists to deal with it, and it's hard for the lawyers to deal with it. I mean, having sat on cases myself where you look at questions of whether complex algorithms being applied in computers, are they new inventions, or is it just a mere business method being changed into a computer? It depends on how you look at it. On one hand, these things you can say are very complex, and it's very easy to say no, they're very straightforward. But this concept between what mankind can do and what it can be done by a machine, and where it can veer off in terms of correlations that are only objectively utilised rather than applying logic to them. Human logic to them, of course, is another issue, and I think it's going to raise a lot of questions. There are already some questions that have come up that I'll deal with later as to patentability and creativity, and we'll come back to those. But now let's now turn to Lyria, because Lyria has also spent a lot of time working in this field. Lyria is the director of the Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation at UNSW, and she's written about the limitations of AI and data-driven approaches to decision-making in government, law enforcement and the legal system. and thought about why it's crucial for everyone to understand how smart machines are impacting on our society, and also in the interaction between law and science on what the law should be doing about it, too much, too little, or what do we do? How much do we interfere with this ourselves? So I'm going to hand over to Lyria.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to really bring law into this discussion. And there are two senses in which law interacts with artificial intelligence. There's the use of artificial intelligence in legal institutions or legal practice. And then there's the law's regulatory role. And that's not just laws that mention the word AI, but rather the ways in which different kinds of law, privacy law, discrimination law, tort law, consumer law, and so forth, operate in relation to both AI practices and, of course, AI companies. So of those two, both of which are really interesting, I'm going to focus this evening on the second. So why do people want law to have a regulatory role in the context of AI? Well, there's various things that people are worried about, and some of these have already been mentioned and some other things have been mentioned, but here's sort of my brief sketch. So some of them are associated with the idea of using insights from data to make decisions. And a lot of this was the focus of what Ed was talking about. But what I want to focus on here is all of the sort of unfair bias challenges. So if data used to train a machine learning model is collected in circumstances influenced by real world bias, perhaps you're looking at crime databases or social media streams or who are the existing employees in an organization, then the system will learn those same biases that exist in the historic data. Alternatively, one might choose a machine learning model that ignores or dismisses the relevance of outliers or makes other assumptions in ways that effectively ignore particular categories of people. And this has been a big issue with gender as an example. Or a system might use particular variables like race or other variables that correlate with race to make decisions about people in circumstances where society has, rightly, decided that this is inappropriate. Now, all of those kinds of concerns can be a problem whether we're doing statistics by hand or whether we're using something like machine learning. Obviously, machine learning is faster and more efficient, but the same kinds of problems arise in both contexts. There are other issues, though, that are more specifically associated with automation. So if I'm going back to that AI in legal institutions, we might be worried about the lack of ability to make one's case outside the parameters of a computer system. Alternatively, we might be worried about bugs, errors, or poor design so that we get bad data. And a really good example of that challenge is the government's robo-debt system. We might be worried about lack of accountability in a context where political and social systems assume, if you like, that it is humans that are accountable. We might be worried about killer robots, and I know that's a particular concern of Toby's. And then some other issues are at the intersection of both. And Toby already raised the issue of lack of transparency, and we can debate the importance of that question. But the difficulty of creating reasons for a particular decision is sort of related to both the automation element as well as the data-driven element. And one can come up with more, and the other speakers have. But what I want to focus on now is what the legal response to that ought to be. So I agree, just to make that completely clear, that there needs to be a legal response to these issues. We can't just, as lawyers, ignore all of these challenges and hope that they go away, because they certainly won't. But I disagree with at least some that suggest that please, on the screen. Excellent, thank you. So what I want to look at in particular here is the Europeans' proposed regulation for artificial intelligence, and comment on what I see as the sort of fundamental design flaw underlying that approach. So first of all, to be completely fair, the Commission was asked to draft an AI regulation, and they did exactly what they were told to do. So it's not a criticism of the people who put it together. My point is rather that they were given the wrong task, not that they did it badly. The task they were given is essentially one that we see all the time when law struggles with new technologies. The task was define the technology and then regulate it. Now, at the top of the slide, what I've put there is the definition they came up with, which is ultimately tied to the method. I'll let you read it yourselves. Of course, the point of this is if you do statistics by hand, model or method. Now, the way the regulation works is there are prohibited practices. What Toby was talking of that in the regulation. I won't set it out in full, but things like safety components, metric identification, where they're used in recruitment, polygraphs in law enforcement, and so forth. It's quite long, too much to cover in slides or read. And then what do you have to do if it's a high-risk AI system? Various things like risk management, data governance, transparency, having a human in the loop, and so forth. There are also some requirements in the regulation, the draft regulation, that apply beyond high-risk systems. So there are, for example, rules for transparency for some systems that interact with people. Now, all of these rules, the entire regulation is about AI systems and the manufacturers, suppliers, importers, distributors, and so forth of those systems. So I started out with some problems, and some, as I mentioned, have already been raised by the other speakers. But my question is does this kind of an approach solve the problems I started with? Well, maybe, or at least some of them, or even many of them. But the real question for me is it the best way to solve those problems? So to illustrate my point, I've put one of the red lines at the bottom of the slide. The following AI practices should be prohibited. There's a list. I've just put A. You could put any of them there. You get to the same point. So imagine deleting the words in red, right? So delete the reference to AI here and read the rest of that provision or that red line. Now, to me, the logic, the policy reason behind the prohibition still applies. The adding of AI system to that makes absolutely no difference to the policy justification for the prohibition. And this goes for the rest of the Act. I can't show you the whole thing because being from Europe, it's very, very many pages. But trust me on this. If you think risk assessments are important, and I do, think about whether you should do them for all high-risk activities or only those high-risk activities within a particular technological scope. So the point can be made across the whole regulation. So why does it matter? Why does this point matter? Does it matter? I mean, often law solves a smaller part of a bigger problem. Isn't it okay just to solve it for AI systems now and worry about the rest later? Well, I've got a few problems with it. The first is that history demonstrates that when we tie the scope of legislation to a particular technological object or practice, it quickly becomes obsolete. Many examples of this. My favorite is digital tapes and copyright law. So around the world, when digital tapes were invented, there were special sections of the Copyright Act introduced about how copyright would work for digital tapes. They didn't think, because they didn't understand the concept yet, really, of a digital file in the abstract and the problems of digitization. That wasn't yet on the agenda, but they knew digital tapes. Now, all of those laws became obsolete because I don't know anybody who uses digital tapes. Maybe they use them in some industries, but generally speaking, all the copying that people were worried about is now happening without the tapes. This is very broad, but it doesn't solve the problem for two reasons. First is that sometimes over-inclusiveness rather than under-inclusiveness is the problem in legislation. Second, sometimes organisations do inefficient things to avoid regulation, even though the potential harm is the same. So in other words, they'll deliberately do it in a way that falls outside the AI definition so they don't. On the obligations we're placing around technologically driven categories. Now, I'm all for channeling innovation in positive ways, but I don't think we should channel innovation by reference to arbitrary and inevitably time limited, if you're thinking about the obsolescent problem, technological categories. Now, if we are using a technologically defined scope, in my view, it should be because the concern aligns with that scope. So for AI, I would argue at least, and I hope that we can have some discussion on the panel, but that the real concerns are both with respect to data-driven decision-making in particular context where that's not appropriate, and with respect to over-reliance on automation. But each of those is possible without coming within a definition of artificial intelligence. So I'll stop there and I look forward to questions.
Well, here I come back. Do I come back? I'm on. Well, I have to say, I haven't heard that delivered. I thought that raised a lot of issues. I mean, the issues are particular to AI, but when you think about it, the breadth and narrowness of legislation is hard enough, let alone when it involves technology that the decision makers probably don't fully understand. And I can take it from my own experience. The first time, again, in the Apple and Samsung case, I heard the word heuristics. So, it's legislation that will relate to these. So, well, how it works, what we've got here are issues relating to house and yet are being potentially legislated for us from the audience. I'm going to encourage you, can't be with us because what machine?
We can actually have Svetha.
Main observation about the role that correlation and the challenges that correlation poses. Interestingly enough, that is in some sense one of the most important scientific questions that AI researchers are now turning their attention to. Correlation to identifying causation, to understanding what are the causal links as opposed to the mere correlations. And as Ed said, it ultimately poses a very provocative essay suggesting that maybe science will stop being model-based and be data-driven. We will end up with science which can only discuss the data and no longer has those predictive models that have driven science in the past. And there's lots that we can do in that way, but whether science will be poorer for that. I, in some sense, agree quite a lot. I think that we should be regulating ends, not means. Means will be evolving. But having said that, some of the red lines that we are trying to regulate, like facial recognition, it's impossible to think that any other technology is going to be doing facial recognition. So I think in the case of a technology like facial recognition, we have, or that we could imagine, that would do facial recognition other than AI.
Toby, while you've made that, before I ask the others to comment on that, that raises a question that was specifically directed to you is, do you think that the use of AI for facial recognition should be banned in Australia? She said she's surprised to see.
It is indeed. I'm speaking on ABC 7:30, saying that very thing in about an hour's time. Yes, about half a dozen years ago, I wasn't particularly so worried, like most of my colleagues, about facial recognition because it was so bad. I remember one of my colleagues gave me a demo, and he said, "Oh, I've got this wonderful facial recognition software," and he said, "You put your face there," and I put my face in front of the camera, and it said I was a woman. And so I thought, okay, well, he said, "Toby, you smile." We're so limited because it was so pathetically poor at recognizing people's faces. What concert of 60,000 people, and that shows that the harms that AI does are not because they're new ethical challenges. We're always worried about your face, but computer eyes can, and so that takes us to a new place. And now I'm increasingly of the view I really struggle to think whether it's justified to work on it at all.
Can I just ask Lyria what she thinks about that question about facial recognition?
Particular technology, as we can define, is itself the problem. And this is what we don't want to do. I still think you'd have to be a little bit careful with how you do it. I don't know if we'd want to ban, for example, Apple iPhones opening based on recognizing the face of a user, but we can do that. We can define the technology being the sort of mass, where you have a crowd scene and you're identifying all the faces. We can do that. If you can define it in a way.
So as an example, there are some very positive uses in terms of spotting be acceptable, but to use it in that's.
To ask you this question coming from the Human Rights Commission, you must have thought
very importantly, and that is, you first have to ask what is the proper regulatory object. Generally, regulating technology is both a bad idea. But it's also like trying to regulate the wind or the waves. It's incredibly difficult to do because it shifts and generally it's expected some everyone would understand. I think that there are, and for that reason, when we did our major reports of specific regulation as being something that meant that when you use that technology, facial recognition, in particularly high-risk contexts, for example, when police might use it to try and identify those areas where we consider an exception to the general rule needs to be made, and that there should be specific regulation that draws clear lines. There are some species of facial recognition, for example, where we use it to unlock a smartphone where the risks are relatively low. There are some, like in the policing context, where they're much more significantly higher, but there may be appropriate uses if there are effective controls put in place. And then there are some really exotic uses of the technology that I think there is absolutely no justification for. So to give an example of that, there were some researchers, I think at Stanford, who used facial recognition as a way of seeking to determine people's sexual orientation just by their face. Again, they use that sort of machine learning model that in terms of its potential misuse, some of those more exotic uses that I do think Churchill described democracy as the worst form of government except for all the others. Similarly, I think regulating in the context of facial recognition is the worst approach except for all of the others.
Okay, well, before I continue on this part of the conversation, I've informed that Svetha is now able to come in. So I'm going to bring her in now, and then we'll go back into a broader panel discussion and go back to some of the questions from the audience, which are also terrific. Now, I understand that all I have to do is to say abracadabra. So I'm just going to introduce Svetha. Professor Svetha Venkatesh is the co-director of the Applied Artificial Intelligence Institute at Deakin University and a leading Australian computer scientist who's made fundamental and influential contributions to the field of activity and event recognition in multimedia data. So I'm assuming now this is going to be the moment when she's going to appear magically on the screen.
Live now.
Is it?
Good evening, everyone.
Yes, it is.
What I want to talk to you today is about modern machine,
Svetha,
what happens in modern machine learning. Modern machine learning uses something called deep networks. And if you have a look at these deep networks, they essentially consist of layers on layers of, if you like, what are called digital neurons. And each layer is connected to another layer by these connections. And the output of the previous layer feeds into the next layer and so on and so forth. And these networks can be many, many levels deep. So what happens in these networks is that they're trained with examples of inputs and outputs. So you give it some input, for example, a picture of a cat, and what you want is for the machine to predict that it is really a cat. So how is this done? Initially, all these weights are random. So, you feed it a picture of a cat and it will give you some garbage in the output. And then you compare it with the real output that you want. And this error, you feed it back through the network and keep changing these weights a little at a time. Now, each example, each pair of input and output, which is called an example, will only change it a little bit. But when it looks at millions and millions and millions of these examples, it's said to be trained so that when you give it something, any other input, it can produce the output. So essentially, when in machine learning, when we say learning, what all we mean is that it's estimating the weights of the network. Now, this is the one type of machine learning, and there are other types of machine learning, of course, but this is a dominant form of machine learning today. So what are the types of inputs that you can have? So you can have almost any kind of input. So for example, you could have images. So the task for the machine could be to predict what type of object it is, to recognize the object. So if you look at self-driving cars, for example, they have to recognize what are the objects that they see out there. If you have speech, then you can convert this into a picture like this, which is just nothing but frequency versus time. And this picture can then be used by the machine to predict other aspects. For example, what is the affect? What are they saying? Or you could just have text. So you can see that this is a very, very versatile learning machine where you can take many, many kinds of inputs and you can train it to predict many, many kinds of outputs. And of course, you require a lot of examples, and the more complex the task, the deeper the network and more data is required to train them. So what's a good example of machine learning out there? And this is a recent paper in Nature. And what they did is they took these radar images and they could use deep learning to predict when there was going to be precipitation. And not only could they do it more accurately in terms of where it was going to fall, but also they could do it with shorter lead time. So they had almost, the typical time to precipitation is about 6 hours, and the machine learning could do it, 2 hours earlier than that. So this is an excellent example of how such machines can be used. So what are the things that these kind of current models do well? So the first thing to note is that they require training data, like I said. So the network learns from examples. Some of the tasks that machines do today in machine learning could not have been done even a decade and a half ago. For example, face recognition. So in face recognition, it is trained on millions and millions and millions of faces, because many of these models have millions and millions of these connections whose weights have to be estimated. And before, things like Facebook with, so many faces up there to learn from, these kind of tasks would have almost been impossible. So the more complex the network, the more data it really requires. And there are now modern machines called transformers, which almost seem amazing because you give it, 2 or 3 words to start and can write a story by itself. But these have something like millions of parameters that have to be trained, which take months to train on, super mega networks. But the most important thing to remember is that these only learn what's in the data, which is called in distribution. What it has seen is only learned from the examples that it has seen and that has been presented to it. So this will lead to all kinds of problems, of course, but they can interpolate very well. So if they see 2 things which are close by, even if it hasn't seen something in between, they would be able to interpolate and say what's good in that part. So what are the issues that come because of such networks that might cause us to worry about them? So the first one is, of course, what I call superficial uses of pattern recognition. Now, these machines haven't actually learned anything deep. So for example, if you have an object recognition system like I showed you, it hasn't really learned what is the real difference between a cat and a dog. It just knows, there are these subtle changes in patterns, and if I put it all together, there's a difference between a cat and a dog. So an example of a superficial use of pattern recognition is to use these kind of superficial things to do very complex predictions, for example, employability. So HireView, for example, has a product that can analyze facial movements, word choice, and speaking voices and rank employability. So you can imagine that employability is a much more complex thing that cannot be done by something so simple as that. And of course, since many of the employment services take the CVs on the internet, some of these technologies are used and are cause for worry. So the second thing, and I'm sure I couldn't hear my colleague Toby, but I'm sure he would have talked to you about the bias that comes because of the training data. It has only learned what is in the training data. So for example, even if you've shown it only cats and dogs, it has no way of interpolating or knowing or even something slightly beyond that. So it cannot go to, for example, a fish or some other category that it has not seen. And this is okay when we're talking about objects that, are which don't matter, but then it starts to matter when you look at, for example, machines that have been trained to detect skin cancer. And if they haven't been shown a certain color skin, then they're not good at detecting the cancer on that colored skin. And the other thing is that we can use if you use very little data to train these complex models, it looks like the model has learned, but they're actually very poor models, because in some sense they have just learned the whole data by heart, and they extrapolate very poorly, and their performance will drop drastically as soon as they're applied on new kinds of problems. And I guess the last point that I want to talk about, that other than in very simple cases where the ground truth. So for example, if you're looking at a radiology image and trying to see whether there is a cancer or not, somebody, a trained radiologist has said yes or no. But if you are looking at a machine, for example, looking at employability or doing these kind of rankings in much more complex situations, how do we know what it is actually doing? How do we know that it's doing the right thing? And many of these models are not transparent. So they give you a decision and that's it basically, because as you can see, what is the learning? How do they explain their decision? It's almost impossible to do because it's distributed among those 17 million or 20 million weights that you have in that network. So you can see that these are the issues that cause us a lot to think about, because they can, and these kind of systems are getting embedded in daily applications. So it's important for us to see the ramifications of these. And I guess that's why the talk in this forum today. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think Svetha can hear us, but I think that was a terrific presentation for us, because it raised, although she was meant to go first in my original plan, because she was going to introduce some of this material, in fact, she has also synthesised a lot of the other matters that have been discussed. So I'm going to go back in, but I don't think Svetha, unless someone tells me to the contrary, can participate in the Q&A because she can't hear what's going on. But she also talked about the concept of training data, which of course comes in with a lot of the other matters that have been raised, and what can be the bias that can occur in those systems, but it also variant. So what are we fairly comparing machine decision-making with? Life's experience, or through hearing a case or presenting an argument, such used for machine.
Way that generates. In other words, so think about something like discrimination, or if I can just pick that example. Hires someone because they're male, sort of human, using the kinds of discrimination we don't. Idea of sort of blinding things and blinding the system and just saying, let's not tell it the race or gender, doesn't work in practice, because there are so many correlates for those things. And in fact, telling systems to remove those variables has secondary problems, because if the law is sort of saying the best thing to do is just to avoid race and gender, then there can be a hugely disparate impact that a system might have on a particular population because of those correlates that no one will spot, because they can't properly test the impact of the system on different populations and work out where those differences are. So in other words, we do need to go back and look at our laws and look at, and make sure that they're as robust when applied to the kinds of problems we get with errors in data and then feeding through machine learning into decision-making systems.
Thank you. What about Toby? Do you want to add into this conversation?
I mean, the very nature of these systems are trained on historical data, and by the very nature of that data, it reflects the biases of the system in which it was collected. And yes, humans are not a very good standard. Human decision-making is full of biases, conscious and subconscious, and behavioral psychology is a catalogue of all of those biases. And so there is the promise that we could perhaps do better in a more evidence-based way if we allow machines to help us make these decisions. But equally, we've got a catalogue of examples in the last couple of years where we have handed some of that decision-making to machines and discovered that they have made just as bad biases, indeed, in some sense that they're worse because they're black box systems, then they don't perhaps, it's the machines, and so can't be, the one significant difference between machines making decisions and humans making decisions is you can hold humans accountable, you can't hold machines accountable. And so there are a disadvantage. So there is a promise. I want to just make two final observations. The first is that ultimately I think we should hold machines to higher standards because we can, because they don't have all of our limitations. And so we should be striving for them to make better decisions than us and hold them to higher standards than humans, because they aren't, they won't fall prey to some of the problems that humans have. They'll be able to look at larger data sets. They won't have our mortal limitations.
Well, you're the person who raised ethical frameworks originally too. So I have a question for you. How do you put an ethical framework into the machine decision making?
I'll come to that in a second. And then the second is to make the observation, which is people often say, well, we've identified there's this bias in human decision making and machine decision making. Let's just remove this bias. And there are many settings where that's just not technically possible. If we are building a system to select a small number of people to call for interview or a small number of people to give loans, that's a bias. Indeed, the old-fashioned name for machine learning is inductive bias. It's finding the right bias on the data set to extrapolate from. And ultimately, selecting a small number out of a big set is a bias. We have to just ask the question, is that the bias that we as a society find acceptable? It's not biased against people based on gender, it's not biased based upon a race, but it is biased based upon the probability that you're going to pay back the loan, or the probability that you're going to be good at the job, or whatever it is that we as a society has decided is an acceptable bias on which to select this small set of people out of the bigger set. There is no unbiased answer. Is it just an acceptable bias?
Well, there you go. I suppose you're right. You're holding to a higher standard, but there's still there are errors. There are errors at every level. Ed, do you want to come in on this point?
Via Michael Murray, which is what's the standard that we should be holding machines to? And there are a couple of, I think, really important general principles that I think we should bear in mind. The first is that if we're making significant decisions, we shouldn't adopt a process, either a machine or a human, if that is clearly going to be the inferior way of getting to the truth. When the truth really matters. And I appreciate that there are situations where the truth doesn't matter so much. But in other words, so if we're using a system to identify a criminal suspect, and if it's true, and it remains true today, that on the whole, facial recognition technology, the very, very best available, is just simply not as accurate at making that identification as a human, acknowledging that humans are not that good at that either, then in that kind of momentous area of decision making, we should not use the machine. It's to my mind that simple. The problem is that sometimes we kind of lose sight of it a bit, because there are some real kind of tech enthusiasts who point to the fact that we're on a really steep trajectory. And it's certainly true that if you take an area like facial recognition, it is improving really, really quickly. But that's not the same as saying that it is as good as the state of the art, nor is it the same as saying it is as good as it needs to be. And ultimately, I think Toby makes a really good point, which is sometimes for machine decision making, we may...
Okay. Well,
Ed, can I ask you a legal and a moral question, which is, at some point, autonomous cars are going to be humans aren't driving, machines are driving. Is that the standard at which we...
Founding factors bound up in all of that, for example. But ultimately, the pleasure that someone might take in driving a car, in my mind, should not be given greater weight than that question of safety. And so I think there'll be general principles that we can bring to bear, but they'll need to be kind of worked through in the different contexts that they arise.
It brings out another point, if I may say so too, and that is the question. You're assuming in that question to some degree, Toby, that there is a single technology, that the decision is made for a standardised technology. What we know from the telecommunications industry is that then you have to look at do you then force manufacturers to standardise all of these technologies, and then you have all sorts of provisions, of licensing requirements and all of the other questions. Because your example of self-driving cars, what if it's a really good technology for self-driving? I mean, do you bring a law in that says no human can drive the car? Because there is a technology out there that has a much more efficient system. But what if not all implementers of the technologies implement the same level of that? So I'm just going to leave that open, because I think that's a whole other area. But I'm going to go back.
It is a really good example, though, of the role that regulation of the law has to play. And we only have to look at, for example, the aviation industry. Aviation now is far the most safe form of travel by various metrics. You're more likely to die driving to the airport than getting on the plane and flying almost anywhere. And how did that happen? And that's what we should hope for, indeed, with autonomous cars, is because it was heavily regulated. And so all the safety lessons were learned. It was a safety ratchet that went up. And that's why I would welcome more regulation for artificial intelligence, because I want it to end up like aviation.
Well, then you're hitting Lyria's, some of Lyria's walls in the where, what, how, and at what stage you regulate them and how wide you go. But anyway, we've started, some of that started, and I can see that. Let me just go back to some of the questions that have been actually asked, because there's one that transitions into that from facial recognition, self-driving cars, and aircraft. We have a question from Sandra is, how will we go about effective regulation and governance in the healthcare sector when new AI devices come to market? Does anyone want to have a go at that one?
I think the starting point should be to regulate the outcome, right? And so accuracy, of course, really matters in the healthcare sector. I think that there's some pretty cogent research at the moment that suggests that the best human diagnostician is not as accurate as the leading kind of AI-powered tool to diagnose certain forms of skin cancer, melanoma. And so that actually, I do think, raises a really important question, which is then if that AI-powered tool is readily available, should it still be permissible to use the human to make that really momentous diagnostic decision? And but fundamentally, that for me is not about regulating the technology; it's regulating the the outcome, which is, have you chosen as a doctor to use the most accurate, readily available technique to perform your diagnosis? And if you haven't, have you breached some kind of legal stroke ethical rule? Have you potentially, acted negligently? And in a sense, we do that all the time, right? So if a human doctor today was trying to diagnose a patient who was ill, and that human doctor said, well, look, my method of diagnosis is heavily reliant on, looking at the stars and checking my astrological signs and so on. We would know that that's clearly going to get the doctor into all kinds of legal problems. It's not a technological issue. It's simply that they haven't followed the best available kind of methodology. And so I think we should continue to apply that principle.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'd like to see if other people wanted to comment about that, because that might also depend upon, there are all sorts of subjective questions there. There's questions of availability in different parts of the world. There's questions of, I'm not a doctor, but questions of diagnosis of something specific that has a specific tool available, not necessarily in the context of the whole body, which might be a doctor's view that it's a different matter. So, that raises a lot of questions for me, but I'd rather hear what the panel have to say about that concept. Does anyone else want to comment about that? About the fact that, if no one else did, because a doctor that didn't take advantage of this particular effect.
So Ed mentioned negligence, and one thing I really like about negligence is that it is completely technology neutral, right? So used in light of the availability and standard practice and all of those things, which I really like. The other point I'd make, though, is that a lot of the time we think get authorization before you can put it on the market, that kind of thing. And we did a really interesting exercise a number of years ago for nanotechnology, very different technology. But there was, again, a gap that was identified when you looked at the way the laws were written. A lot of nano versions of particular chemicals were falling into the gaps because there was already an existing version of the chemical, the nano devices in the body and so forth, that we go back to those laws and just make sure that the kinds of testing required, the kinds of categorization of things
thinking about raising himself, but also came into one of the questions from the audience. It is a double whammy in a way, because the question from the audience from Natalie was, should an AI be able to be recorded as an inventor of a patentable invention? And I think we got into this, and I wasn't sure how much this went public before Svetha's presentation started, but that, of course, is currently being considered throughout the world. And an Australian judge has said yes, and in other countries, judges have said no. But it also brings in, Toby, something that you raised, which is can machines be creative? Because an invention is it's got to have an inventive step and matters such as that. So can machines be creative, and should, without going to the law of patents, which is something that I could spend the next 3 hours discussing on whether or not you can have a machine as an inventor of a patentable invention, which I won't do because it would bore everybody else witless. But as a general concept, just looking at questions of machine learning, do you think that a machine itself is creative or can be creative, and should it as a layman's terms be allowed to be named as the inventor rather than the person who drafted the algorithms or anything such as that? I'm going to get Toby to go first on this one.
This is a question that's haunted the field of artificial intelligence, indeed, since before we invented computers. Ada Lovelace, who was the assistant to George Babbage, who was trying to build the first mechanical computer back in the 18th century, actually raised this very question and suggested the answer was no. And indeed, whenever we do anything in AI, people say, oh, yes, you've done that, but AI can't do X. And one of those X's is be creative. And I'm very skeptical about that. I'm very skeptical that ultimately we are biological machines, and most of the things that we can do, ultimately we've got computers to do. And there are things you can do to make yourself more creative. There are tricks you can do. And those are the sorts of tricks that we're starting to teach computers to do. And so computers are starting to write bad poetry and paint paintings that are sold by Sotheby's, write poems, not very good poems, so I do think ultimately there's no reason to suppose, there's nothing profound about the human brain that makes us the only creative machine on the planet, and that we have a few examples. Indeed, I've had worked on a project with a PhD student where we wrote a computer program, an AI program, to invent new mathematics, that ultimately machines will be creative. So I don't think it's a technical question, it's more a economic and legal question, which is, do we want to afford the sorts of protections to the things that machines create that we afford protections to humans, because that encourages innovation and productivity within our marketplaces? And that's a question I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Well, before we go into that, it also raises something else that I'm going to ask people to comment about with that, and another one, which is, because does that raise questions about where humans do come into things like ethics? Is there a role for AI ethics as part of this expansion of the role of AI? So, Toby, I'll come back to you on that aspect of it, because I'm going to go to the other panelists on that. Lyria.
I think that AI ethics suffers at least some of the same problems as AI regulation. So I'm going to give you a bit of an example of this. So if you look at the, you look at the Department of Industry and their ethics principles, their AI ethics principles, it says throughout their life cycle, AI systems should benefit individuals, society, and the environment. And that sounds great. But most AI ethical principles are literally ethical statements that most people would agree with, and then adding the words AI systems somewhere along the way, which is, I think, at least a bit of an unthinking approach to applied ethics. So ethics are really important. I actually think they should be mandatory in high school. But the way we talk about AI ethics, at least at the moment, I think makes a bit of a mockery of something as deep as moral philosophy. It ignores years of contestation about what is the right way to be in the world and so forth, and pretends that we can sort of make these very simplistic statements when it's about something other than us, i.e. AI systems have to do all of these things. So I think, I'm not saying I don't think it would be useful to have deep moral philosophy and really consider some of the issues that AI raises. I think that's an important thing to do, but I don't think what we're currently labeling AI ethics that I've seen does much of that.
Okay, now listen, I've got so many more questions. I'm going to go to Ed for a comment on this. We've got 2 minutes left in this entire session, and I've got so many more things that I wanted to ask and people to comment. You've got things to say and they've got things to say. Ed, short answer on that one. It's a big question, short answer.
Yeah, no, I agree with Lyria. It's the very short answer. I mean, I think that there's a really important category error that we make sometimes. So Lyria gave the example of discrimination. So the bank, you go to a bank like a bricks and mortar bank, you apply for a home loan, and the bank teller says, look, we're not going to give you a home loan because we don't give home loans to people of your gender. That everyone would know that that is clearly unlawful discrimination. But if it's an algorithm that does that same thing, we start to question ourselves, is that an ethical issue or a legal issue? It's not, it's a legal issue. And we need to categorise it as such so that we can have a proper regulatory response. I think, as Lyria points out, there are genuine ethical questions that arise in the shadow of the law, and that's where we should have a much more sophisticated conversation about how they should be answered.
Okay, well, look, I can see the time, and I'm not a good moderator if I don't stick to it. I can take some of the other questions that have raised have come up with some very interesting points about whether there should be a TGA type of body that helps deal with some of the matters that we discussed earlier and regulate device use and when things should and shouldn't happen. There was a whole question raised about accountability for AI, that if AI is going to do some of these things, then how do we hold AI, should we hold AI accountable, and how should we do it? Should we make sure computers never use the word I, was one of the questions, so that you know the decision's not being made by a person but by a machine. So is that a transparency issue? There are a lot of other, I can't tell you how many other questions there are, so it's obviously you've stimulated a lot of thought, but at the moment we can't get to it because I'm instructed that we've got to hand over. So before I do, I'm just going to say my thanks. I have learned a lot from this panel. I think you've done absolutely been fantastic. I thank Svetha for making the effort to persevere to come in, even though she had huge technical issues, and I'd like to thank her. Toby, Lyria, Ed, thank you very, very much, because it's been the interaction between you and the issues that you've raised, I think, make it clear that the academies will have to have part 2 of this issue in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, and after asking everyone online to, at least in their own homes, clap their hands to say thank you very much to the speakers, I'm now going to hand over to the Chief Executive of the Academy of Science, Anna Maria Arabia.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I'm speaking on behalf of the Academy of Science President, Professor John Shine, who unfortunately is unable to be with us today. Before I thank those involved in producing tonight's event, I wish to acknowledge that there have been some technical issues, and thank you for your patience as we've dealt with those. The recording of this event will be available after the event on the Australian Academy of Science website, and I encourage you to have a look at it there and share it with others who may be interested. On behalf of both academies, I too would like to express my thanks to our speakers tonight. It's been such an interesting and relevant topic to our times, and it's great to look at things from all these perspectives. It reinforces for me that the intersection between science and the law is rich and needs to be explored more and more. A huge thank you to you, Dr. Annabelle Bennett. It's been wonderful having you facilitate this event and bringing your knowledge, energy and enthusiasm to it. Thank you very much. Thank you to the President of the Australian Academy of Law, the Honourable Alan Robinson. We've thoroughly enjoyed our collaborations with you and your team, and we look forward to many more in the future. Thank you also to the staff of both academies for making this event happen. And finally, an enormous thank you to you, our audience, for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us again next year, hopefully in person at the wonderful Shine Dome. With that, I thank you and wish you all good evening.